Welcome to SVA and welcome to the Design Criticism Department. I'm Alice Twemlow, I'm the chair of the Design Criticism Department, and I have a couple of announcements just to make before we get going with tonight's lecture. And it's really just to draw your attention to two bits of paper which are floating around the department right now. And one is this beautiful brochure which we had produced to sort of show and document the stories of the graduates of the DCRIT program, all the amazing jobs and works that they've gone on to do following the program. So do take a look through that. And if you have any questions about the program, talk to me afterwards over a drink in the other room, or consult our website, follow us on Twitter, and email me anytime. The other thing to mention is that this summer will be our second installment of a 2-week intensive. We started this last year and it was such fun, we decided to do it again. And the intensive is devoted to design, writing and research. We spend a hot 2 weeks in the summer running around town, visiting architectural sites of interest, going behind the scenes of museum exhibitions, interviewing famous designers and having a lot of fun. So if you're interested in that kind of immersion, then check out this program and again, talk to me afterwards. Some of the faculty on that intensive include Carrie Jacobs, the urban critic, Jennifer Cabot, who teaches how to write profiles of designers, Adam Harrison Levi, who teaches interview techniques, Rob Walker, you'll probably know from his Significant Objects project, and Mimi Ziga. So it's a lot of fun. Okay, now what you're in tonight is the spring lecture series, which is carefully put together for you by the first year students of the program. You can see you've missed a couple of corkers, but you can catch up on them on the Vimeo site, the DCRIT Vimeo site, so do take a look. And we've got some great ones to come. Do note that the next one, which is Sandy Speaker, who is the education director for IDEO, is actually on Monday, next Monday. That's just a slight aberration to our normal Tuesday evening format. So join us for more. And it's now my pleasure to turn over the podium to one of our first year students who will be hosting tonight's event. And I'd like to introduce you all to Linda Decker.
Good evening. I'm Linda Decker. I'm a first-year student here at DCRIT, and I'm also a surfer. I grew up near the beach, and for me, climate change, rising sea levels, and the devastation that superstorms cause is personal. Many of my friends lost their homes in Hurricane Sandy. Our guest this evening is Susannah Drake, an architect and landscape architect who seems to share my concern about urban planning practices that fail to take into account climate change. She has most recently received the 2013 Young Architects Award from the AIA for her public projects that address environmental systems and rising sea levels. Susannah's contribution to the 2010 Museum of Modern Art show, Rising Currents, proposed porous streets and an extension of the shoreline with wetlands to mitigate the force of storm surges. From our post-Sandy vantage point, this appears to have been very prescient. As a result, the media relied on her expertise as a counterpoint to the call for seawalls and storm barriers. The issues here are complicated and emotionally charged. Are storm barriers necessary regardless of the economic and environmental cost? Do we rethink how we develop the waterfront? And should we rebuild in areas that are vulnerable? And with all of the design talent that we have here in New York City, why aren't we implementing more innovative solutions? Tonight, Susannah will speak to us about new ways to create infrastructure that is cost-effective, enriches our coastal ecology, and will help us to weather future storms. Please join me in welcoming Susannah Drake.
Put it on top. So thank you for having me here. I have a sort of facetious answer about why we can't get things done in New York City, but you'll see how that plays out in the lecture. Let's see. Oh. It's okay. All we have to do is play, right? And then we have to do just view full screen. There we go. Okay, now we're good. It's the old Mac PC interface. So my lecture tonight is called Ecology, Public Space and Infrastructure, Resilient Urban Environments. I really strive to make infrastructure systems that are more resilient to climate change. Infrastructure is a term developed in the World War II era in reference to military logistical operations, which I think is an interesting idea to think about. But cities really require a much more holistic view. It's not just about going to battle, but we need to be thinking about habitat, color theory, drainage, geomorphology, horticulture, hydrology, structure, soil science, geography, restoration, urban design, community activism, sociology, history, and infrastructure. And these aren't always the purview of urban planners and urban designers. There are aspects here that require more a sort of greater depth of thinking. So I want to talk a bit about systems because it has a lot to do with the way I operate, both urban systems and natural systems. And you can sort of get an idea of sort of the purest visions of either of those with the Manhattan project, Eric Sanderson's project on the upper your right, showing the view of Manhattan before it was built, and then this view later as the city started to develop. The city really developed in relation to exchange, but there are types of exchange. There's urban exchange, or there's mercantile exchange, and then there's ecological exchange, and they have different characteristics. The city also developed in relation to movement. We can think about movement in relation to extreme visions of Robert Moses, or a more sort of pastoral vision of Riverside Park from Olmsted. It's interesting to actually look at Riverside Park as an example, because when Olmsted designed it, it was really this beautiful buffer between the city and the rail yards down along, and the roads along the river, but it did sort of disconnect you from the river. But with the development over the centuries. What happened was we pushed out the shoreline and we built new highways. But what we also did, or what Clark and Lloyd did in 1937, was actually to stack over those rail lines. And it was it's really an important example for me, because I think this is something that should be happening throughout the city. And I think it should be happening throughout cities across the country. That we have this really valuable land that is used for one purpose, for transportation, for infrastructure, and it could be used for so much more. So the other issue in our cities is containment. Containment of water works really until it doesn't. This is a view that my Harvard students put together a few years ago of the impact of the 1938 hurricane on Lower Manhattan. And it's interesting to correlate that with the hydrology, or this hydrologic Ville map from the mid-1850s that shows exactly where that water was, and basically it went back to where it was. And this is actually an image of New Orleans after Katrina. We have this huge economic risk, and we need to start taking it much more seriously. We also have economic value that we need to consider in the development of green infrastructure. It's actually, we can start to quantify sort of the value of trees. This is a diagram that we put together for a project on the BQE. Adding 350 trees will generate $250,000 worth of oxygen, provide almost $500,000 in pollution control, recycle $300,000 worth of water, and contribute almost $4 million in shade value for a 10-year gain of $50 million. Now, this data came from this really awful, boring document that was like 4 inches thick that was put together by the U.S. Forest Service. So we read it, and we turned it into a one-page diagram, and then we used that diagram to get a federal appropriation. So this is a lesson for the students in the School of Visual Arts that, the visual has huge power if you can convey information in a really effective way. So I'm going to show you some projects from some sites around the city, from Lower Manhattan, from around the Gowanus Canal, and then we've almost got all the boroughs. I don't have Staten Island in here yet, but site in Queens, site up in the Bronx. So this is a project for the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. We're really trying to heal the wounds of this expressway that went through various neighborhoods. We have a vision for how we might actually transform these neighborhoods with park space, with open space. In the near term, we might think about adding the street trees that I told you before and maybe some green walls to enhance the connections. And then in the longer term, thinking about how we might cap the expressway. This is actually an area in Cobble Hill between Atlantic Avenue and the tunnel that goes into Manhattan, and how we might cap that space and turn it into a new public park that could connect in with Brooklyn Bridge Park. In Williamsburg, we're doing a two-block area, or a shorter space. This is a slightly less ambitious project. The other one probably would have cost about $1 billion. This one's only $100 million, so this one's actually almost doable. But we really looked at the feasibility of what we were working with. We were working for Councilwoman Reyna on this project, trying to figure out how we could cap an area in her district. So we're looking at the area between Boringquin and Broadway on the BQE. And as you can see, there's very different conditions in these different blocks. And what we determined was that in the three northern blocks, the three northern blocks, we actually had a space where we could either span or touch down. And in the southern block, we really couldn't touch down because we just didn't have the space. And one of the critical issues here was that we had to bring the highway up to federal code, because right now it's really not meeting federal code. And so we'd have to have 16 feet of clearance. And so we had to make the deck actually very thin. So we worked very closely with our structural engineering team to figure out how we could do that. And then we also logistically planned what kinds of programs could happen on top of that thin deck. And we ended up working with the community very closely on what those programs would be, and what they wanted was recreation space, which worked out well because we ended up putting turf fields over the center span and then putting more of the heavier programs, the programs that also required more soil depth along the edges. So where we had soil we had structure, we could have more trees and more green, and then in the center is actually artificial turf. And this was our vision for how that would look, and provide a new sort of whole amenity for the community. There are 772 cities in the US that have combined sewer systems. And what our goal really in a lot of our work is to increase the permeability of cities, to make them more absorbent. There are also 7,200 miles of bridges and elevated highways that run through cities. And you can see, here's a map of some of the concentrations of those elevated highways. So what we started thinking about was the relationship between CSOs and infrastructure. There are a lot of places where you have what they call a scupper. It's basically like a downspout that relates to the highway, but the highway people call them scuppers. And you can see that basically what happens is all that water just drains out onto the road. So our idea is to actually capture that in planting beds to make new permeable area underneath these highway overpasses. And yes, you'd say, okay, how do plants grow in the shade? We've actually mapped it so we know where the solar angles are so that we can actually have pretty flowers underneath the highways. But we're doing a couple of different pilots. One is actually up in the Bronx, and this is the Major Deegan Expressway. And this is kind of a pop-up system. So we're looking at using planters, and we have a couple of different ideas for how this is working, and it's all in development right now, so it hasn't been totally worked out. But we need to have a sedimentation basin and then these planter spaces, and this one actually has a drain that allows the water to go out, even though there is no actual drain in this park. So this other one actually has the water go into a dry well. So when we started this project, there were these DOT planters that were on site. So we thought, well, we can just use the DOT planters and retrofit them and make it all work and make it really inexpensive for this community group up in the Bronx, and this would be great. But then we started thinking about how we could do this elsewhere and how you could take something as ubiquitous as the Jersey barrier and turn it into a planter and actually expand this, because we realized that there are a lot of these scuppers all along this area. And again, this is a pop-up. So, you know, you put it up, the Jersey barriers come in lots of colors. We thought this could be kind of fun. It's kind of a, you know, a riff on a new kind of infrastructure. So, and eventually the idea is that this would lead to the development of a new park. I think ultimately, if there were funding, the Parks Department would love to turn this whole area into a park. But at this point, they've only done Mill Pond Park up on the northern end of the site. So we also have this project for the Flushing Sponge Park. And in this case, there's a lot of discharge from these highways into the Flushing Creek. And we're developing 2 different prototypes here. And this one is actually, it's more of an in-ground system. So we developed this kind of concrete basin that has, again, has the sedimentation basin and then the planting bed along the end. And, you know, we're looking at different kinds of plant capabilities. You know, we need plants that can handle hydrocarbon degradation and accumulation, that they're stormwater tolerant. You know, they can handle the salts. They can also have the capacity to accumulate heavy metals. So, in this next project, this is probably one that we're known for more. It's called the Gowanus Canal Sponge Park, and this is where that whole concept of, you know, sponge equals wetland came from, because I didn't want to go into a community meeting and say, I'm going to put wetlands in your backyard, because I thought I'm going to be, you know, crucified. So I thought, okay, we need to think of a better way of thinking about adding permeability to the streets. And so we looked at the watershed of the Gowanus. It's interesting to actually look at the Gowanus Canal and see what it was. It was this swamp, basically. And over time, it got kind of shrunken and almost containerized, contained to the state that it's in now. It's also interesting to look at, if you look at the map on the top, there are 2 different lines. There's the lines, or there's the boundary of where the water would flow naturally if there wasn't any city there, and then there are the lines of where the sewer jurisdiction makes the water go. And so we looked at both of those, and we also calculated how much water was going into this zone to figure out how much open space we would need to absorb all of this water. You can see that in the Gowanus there is a lot of flooding and surface water runoff. This is not even during a major storm. This was in, you know, just a sort of regular storm. And then in that, or with that flooding, a lot of this detritus ends up at the street ends. The other issue is that, you know, combined sewer overflow is basically where the sanitary sewers and the storm sewers combine when you have one of these storms. And on average, I think 400 million gallons of this combined effluent go into the harbor every week. And this is actually raw sewage sitting on the top of the Gowanus Canal. It can get pretty fetid sometimes, even on a nice day. So we looked at the places where this sewage, or this combined sewage effluent, was being pumped into the canal, and mapped that, and then also mapped the locations of the storm drains and the direct drainage. And we developed this open space system to help, you know, ameliorate this problem. We looked for locations that developers were working on. We looked for areas that the city owned, and we tried to connect a lot of those zones to make this a whole kind of neighborhood system. In an average rainfall, these upland swales manage a lot of the stormwater runoff. But then the idea is in a heavy rainfall that the water would be directed to the street end and be managed in a more intensive way. Our thought was that you could have walkways that actually span over some of these wetlands. This is our street end sponge park at Sackett Street. And here's a view south to a cultural redevelopment area. This building was recently purchased, and the owner is thinking about what he's going to do and wants to make it into an art center. So in the middle of our work there, the area was designated an EPA Superfund site, which made it really interesting, and jurisdictionally it was already complicated, and it made it even more complicated. But you can see the extent of the toxins. The red line shows the sort of area of the sort of toxic ooze, as it were. There are a lot of different things in that material that are all really bad for you, just to keep it simple. I don't want to go into it because it's so there's just too many things. You just don't want to touch that water or that sediment or breathe any of the dust around that area. So, but one of the things that I think holds back work happening in New York City that you were talking about is all of the different agencies that you have to consult in order to do this work. And like, for instance, in this is my favorite diagram ever because it makes it clear just how complicated it is. The sediment underneath this water is controlled by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, or it was until the EPA Superfund people came in. So now they're controlling that. The soil that's underneath the street in this area is controlled by the Department of Environmental Conservation because it's a brownfield area. The street bed is controlled by the Department of Transportation. The plants are controlled by the Parks Department. The water that flows over the street is controlled by the Department of Environmental Protection. The shade over this water is controlled by the Department of Environmental Conservation, the state agency. The waterway is a navigable waterway, so the Army Corps of Engineers has to weigh in on that. And then you have the normal things like the fire department and the sanitation department, and then of course there's the Department of City Planning, which controls setbacks from the water. And then the funny thing is we also encountered that we had to get a permit from the Department of Small Business Services because apparently there used to be some issue of people unloading goods and services or goods from the waterfront, and so you had to get some permit from them for that. And so anyway, it's this archaic rule that still exists, and it was another permit that we had to get along the way. Now we're at 90% drawings with this first pilot project that I'm going to talk about now. But we still have to go through, I think, 14 different agency heads at the Department of Environmental Protection in order to actually get the approvals at this late stage in the game. So it can be kind of challenging, to say the least. So, but we are doing this pilot, and we've managed to get a lot of grant money to do this, which is also a really unprecedented process. We raised almost $2 million to do this project from the EPA, from the New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission, from the State Department of Environmental Conservation, from a couple of different city council people, from the borough president. So like we've managed to garner a lot of support for it, and we've been in this kind of weird hybrid partnership with the Department of Environmental Protection to do this project. So we looked at the water volume of the different streets and picked one that had the highest capacity or the highest impact. And we ended up developing this prototype that has both the stormwater swales upland and then this sponge park along the street end. When you develop one piece of a project, you have to think about how that piece is going to eventually relate to the larger whole, and it has, developed from our overall scheme so that it can be expanded, but it really exists also on its own, or can exist on its own. We developed this series of bioretention cells. We built it in a modular way so that it could be replicated in other areas. There's a sedimentation basin, and basically what happens is the water comes down the street and goes into this basin, and then it flows into these different cells. And if there's a really heavy rain, it'll go into this sedimentation basin, or this sand filter, and then go into the canal. So, and this is an image of the overall scheme. So this is a project I haven't talked about a lot, but it's a relatively new one. 35 million tons of CO2 are saved annually by solar energy use. We developed this idea for a park working with the Downtown Alliance. This is down at Edgar Plaza. And our thought was to take it was a site that really was very underutilized, and regrade it and put in these shade canopies that would also provide solar energy. So you could go and plug in your laptop or your cell phone or whatever, and you could work outside in the shade in this area that's between the World Trade Center and the place where you get onto the ferry at the Statue of Liberty. Or at least that's, you know, the goal for the Alliance was to make it so there's a place for the community and also a place where tourists would be able to have a respite. An interesting correlation here with some of the MoMA Rising Currents work, we did this after MoMA, is that the line of the 1625 water line actually went through our site. So what we did was we regraded the upland area, and then we had this line. So all the water actually flows down into planting beds that are in that lower zone or in the area that would have been flooded and that may be flooded again. So our thought was a sort of a recognition of where those old edges were. And then here you can see an overview of the site with the solar canopies. And really what we were looking at is sort of, we pulled apart the information. The canopy, this is for the visual representation is really important in our work, but pulling apart the canopy, the lighting, the seating, the grading on the ground that allows the water to go down into this planting bed, the vegetation and the grade, sort of pulling apart those pieces and analyzing them separately and then putting them all back together. And now I'm going to talk a bit about the Rising Currents exhibition. We really need to prepare. I mean, that's a lot more clear since Sandy, because, you know, we actually experienced some of these green zones. Scientists project a 6-foot sea level rise in the next 80 years, and who knows, it may happen faster. Hopefully it won't. But, you know, our edge morphology in 1650 was a natural edge. I showed you that image of sort of the edge of Manhattan, you know, 400 years ago. You know, it was this soft edge, which was great for the ecology, but it wasn't very good for shipping. You know, it was really kind of a pain in the neck to try to get goods over to the water's edge. So, you know, we basically kept building out, and we built out and we also hardened. And in some places we created these slips where the boats could come in. And that's why Exchange Place is called Exchange Place, because it was the place where you actually physically exchanged goods. And, you know, as ships got bigger, the morphology changed. By 1960, we had these finger piers going out into the harbor. But then, you know, the shipping moved out to the areas where you had large expanses of parking as we started to containerize our shipping. So there really wasn't the need for those piers on the water's edge, and we had a change to this disconnected morphology. It was really much more of a recreational edge. So we have this edge morphology in 2100 with a huge value at risk. And so with the MoMA project, what we looked at was water sources, both the fresh water coming from rain, so going back to my CSO issues, and then the potential for this saltwater inundation from storm surge. So we developed this porous green street system, and it's actually a sort of three-tiered system of streets. So we made the streets permeable, and we eliminated actually a lot of the parking downtown. But we put all of the utilities in waterproof vaults underneath the sidewalks. And I put the private utilities in one set of vaults, and I put the public utilities in another set of vaults. And the idea was that you could access them from the sidewalks with hatches, so you wouldn't have to rip up the street all the time or the sidewalk all the time when you wanted to repair them or if you wanted to replace one of your systems. We also developed this these sponge slips to take the water out more quickly, and to develop new kinds of open space. I mean, it can be a public amenity when it's not being used for storm resilience. So the idea was to make a more resilient system, to have these upland streets and then also this edge system. Within this edge system, we had these conditions of estuary, but also recreational spaces in the upland zones. So at the battery, we developed the battery breakwater, and our thought was with these that we'd create these barrier islands made out of basically geotextile sacks that were filled with dredge material. And the thought was, in this zone, it's actually pretty shallow water, and the currents are such that they kind of split around, so you could do this. And ultimately, over time, this whole landscape would transform into something completely different than what I'm proposing there. But that's okay, and we kind of want that to happen. We want it to take on a life of its own. That's the idea. We want it to be a healthy ecology that will morph over time. So on the East River, we had an estuary. We developed this estuary. We had what we called the urban esker. It was a kind of large bermed space that would protect the east side from massive flooding. And on the inside of that, that's where you'd have the sponge slips feeding in. Here we'd have these walkways going out over the wetlands. And all of this would make a new urban ground and a new resilient city. So after MoMA, we started looking at other cities and how we might develop systems, sort of ecological systems for protecting them from climate impacts. And 40% of the world's population lives within 100 kilometers of the coast. I don't know if you all saw, there was an article in the newspaper the other day that was looking at sort of old sea levels and subsidence issues. And some of the things that the geologists are studying are actually kind of alarming because it could mean that 200 feet inland is actually where we can project or 200 feet up is where we could project our sea level rise to be in 80 years. But in any case, we'll wait until the research comes out on that one. But we looked at 5 different areas, and I'm only going to talk about one today. But we looked at another site in New York. We looked at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. We looked at Miami. We looked at Karachi, Pakistan, and Shanghai, and also the Nile River Delta. And actually, the Nile River Delta is pretty interesting because there, the delta, the issue there is not hurricanes, it's not storm surge, it's actually just the rise of sea levels. And 40% of the area's food actually comes from that delta, and 50% of the delta is going to be inundated with water, with salt water. So they're going to have to either change their agricultural systems or do something very quickly. Our proposal was actually looking at changing to an export economy, potentially looking at biofuels, looking at plants that could actually withstand the salt tolerance or the salt inundation, and work from there. But we're just starting to do that kind of research. But on Miami, it's interesting because here you have the flooding coming from the Atlantic Ocean, and you also have flooding coming from the Everglades. And Miami actually sits on a big bed of limestone. So I don't know if I would buy any real estate in Miami anytime very soon. But their economy is really based on tourism. So we tried to develop a system for protecting that economy. So we looked at an area in Miami Beach where you have all these hotels that are along the waterfront. And one of the things we noticed is that there's really, right now, there's basically lawn between the hotels and the beach. And when you're on the street, you can't see the water. So there's no reason why you couldn't actually develop a more interesting, a more protective, a more topographic kind of landscape in between those hotels and the water. So what we did was we actually tried to bring back more of the natural ecology that exists there, the mangrove forests, and have those between the hotels and the beach. And then also develop more of a tidal inlet, constructed reefs out in the water, and constructed breakwaters and beach swells. So the idea was just sort of this whole kind of integrated system. We're also thinking that, the streets right now have hotels and then lawn. And there's really a potential to develop a barrier here as well. So maybe build within this berm and make this into a more lively street. So it's using both planting ideas and development ideas to make this integrated system to maintain that economy. So now I'm actually just going to show a video to end, and then we can do Q&A. But I do need to switch to a different. I can do this. I see you. It's okay. All right. I just need to get it quickly up. View. Okay. So this is a project we did to connect the airport in Montreal to the center of the city. Oops. Oh, here we go. Thank you very much. Okay, so where do we go? Oh, okay, great. I feel like we need to put up a pretty image. My desktop isn't that pretty. Well, my desktop is kind of pretty.
Should we mainly let her have it? Okay, but you can start. Yes, take a seat.
Susannah, thank you so much.
Well, I hope it kind of gave you the overview. So I didn't really go into depth on a lot of the projects, but so I'm hoping that that leaves time for you to ask questions. Yeah. Right?
So anyway,
Linda's going to start.
Right.
I'm
Okay.
gonna
Great.
just get it rolling here. You can hang on to that. That's
Okay.
okay. Anyway, so you know this is a design criticism program.
Mm-hmm.
Where is the place for critical discourse in all of this?
Well, you know, it's interesting because we work in a lot of different venues, and there's different levels of criticism. There's the criticism that you would get in an academic environment, and you know, when you're in school, you're really sort of learning a particular set of criteria by which you're judged. And then you move into sort of the professional world, and you're being judged by your peers, and you're being judged by the publications. And you know, you're sort of trying to establish your identity and establish your firm and your persona, and that's really important. And then there's also this other level of criticism that happens in the construction of the projects, in the you know, the different agencies that you might work for, the different clients that you might work for, and that's a whole other level of criticism. So it's almost like you have to bring all of these things together to have a successful project. And some of the most interesting discourse, I think, comes from the interaction of all of those different levels of criticism. I mean, when I go to a public meeting, I learn a lot. And you know, you really learn about what people care about. But you also assess your work, not just based on public opinion, but based on just, I don't know, just so many different levels of what people care about.
It struck me, I just wanted to add something there, that how daunting the task might be for a design critic to engage with this. I mean, the amount of, when you showed at the beginning, all those different kind of fields of study that you're kind of having to engage with, and then I'm imagining that the design critic too has to know all of that and more. Does anyone measure up to the task you've seen so far
in terms of criticism?
Yeah,
I mean,
writing about the kind of things you do at the same kind of level that you are practicing.
In terms of writing, I mean, I've been really pleased with sort of the broad, with Michael Kimmelman's writing about urban systems. It's very broad, and it's very interesting, and it's very inclusive and engaging, without being uncritical. It's still very critical. It still cares about design. And I think one of the things that we try to do in our work is, we try to understand sort of a level of performance in the design, and we set up criteria for that, and some of the criteria are aesthetic, and some of them are economic, and some of them are ecological, and we try to make sure that the different sort of areas are being addressed, and but that again, that's self-criticism. In terms of other writers, I think Carrie Jacobs is very great. Actually, we just had an article published in Metropolis about some of that very new and very fledgling work on global ecosystems, and they did an amazing job in terms of distilling both the work that was just hatching and what we said about that work into a very cogent piece, I thought, that really clearly stated our mission, which was great, because sometimes I have reporters, I try to communicate things clearly. Like, for instance, I talked to a reporter from, I think it was from the Wall Street Journal or from the New York Times, one of them, and I said something about how, there's the force of the wave, and the plants and the wetlands will actually dissipate the force of the wave. And I thought that was pretty simple, right? And I'm learning a lot of lessons about talking to the press, but because that wasn't simple enough. And after about 45 minutes on the phone with this woman, I said something about, well, the little blades of grass, they just like, they move the water. I don't know. I said something really simple about just the little blades of grass actually taking care of the water. And I think that's what she printed. And, ultimately, you have to have the responsibility as the designer to know not to say these things, not to dumb it down that much. But it happens. And, that's the lesson I've learned. But if you have a really good writer, they will actually write the smart things about what you've said.
Right, kind of meets the work.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Well, you just started to mention storm surges. There seems to be a whole cadre of engineers at Stony Brook University who are going, at it for pro-storm barriers. And I was just wondering, from your perspective, how much, this is such an emotional issue for so many people who live near the waterfront. What's your opinion in terms of storm barriers versus how much protection could be actually attained by doing some of this other ecological engineering?
Well, we don't know yet. We need to study, but we can't study for too long because we have to, we have to do something now. The nice thing about the ecological approaches is that you can do them now. They're happening now, and they just need to be happening faster now. And I think that given the climate, the sort of regulatory climate and relationships between the city and the state and the federal government are better than they've ever been in terms of actually getting wetlands put in place. So those systems can help now. My fear with the big barrier is that if you put it in, the water still has to go somewhere. And, when I taught the studio at Harvard, one of my students actually noticed this really interesting relationship between Long Island Sound and the Atlantic Ocean, from Flushing sort of across to Gateway National Park. And you know, there's this highway trench that cuts through the terminal moraine in Long Island, and I look at that and I think, yeah, okay, so if you put in the big storm barrier, you know, where's the water going to go? So we started to map it. That's actually part of what started the metropolis thinking as well. Is, you know, I wanted them to print that, like, okay, put in a big barrier and the water's going to go around, and we'll have, you know, Queens will be separated from Long Island. But you know, that's my projection. I don't know if it would actually happen, but looking at the topography, it seems like it could. You know, I don't know. So I'm just worried about the consequences, you know, of what will happen. I mean, look at the Aswan Dam. Look at some of the major engineering projects that we've undertaken as a society that have had disastrous consequences. And you know, these large engineering systems work until they don't, right? Just like, you know, I showed you the water containment in Lower Manhattan. They work until they don't. You know, combined sewers seemed like a good idea at the turn of the century because it solved the sanitary sewer issues of the city. But now we have 772 cities that have these combined sewers, and we have all this sewage going into our harbor. So, you know, we need to think of more resilient systems that can grow with us.
But presumably, in addition to your studies, there are computer modeling programs and things going on where you can sort of see what model.
Well, you know, Eric Sanderson and Phil Orton, who's at the Stevens Institute. So Eric Sanderson is up at the Wildlife Conservancy. He's the one that wrote the book Mannahatta. He's now working, I think they got an NEA grant, an NSF grant, to look at actually modeling the storm surges and what the impacts would be on New York Harbor. So the work is underway. And they're exactly the right people to be doing this because Sanderson understands the ecologies and Phil is a geophysicist. He understands the hydrology and the hydrologic mapping. What they haven't looked at yet, and what I've talked to them about as a next step, is actually mapping that in relation to urban systems. Like what happens with the upland hydrology and how do the two relate? So that's our next grant. Well, that's the next step.
I was just wondering also what you thought about Governor Cuomo's plan to hopefully rebuild, not allow redevelopment in some of these areas that were really devastated by buying back homes. What do you think? Do you think it'll work? Or?
Well, I think in some areas it's really wise. I think it's interesting that Governor Cuomo is now saying don't rebuild, and Mayor Bloomberg is saying rebuild. And you know, I don't think Bloomberg can actually back down from all of the waterfront development that they've done over the last 12 years, right? You know, there's been this big push for this high-rise residential development on the waterfront. So, you know, he has to be careful about what he's saying about that. Cuomo doesn't have those same ties to, I don't know, real estate, I guess. But it seems wise in a lot of areas to just not rebuild. But I think if you are going to rebuild, yes, you need to follow the Bloomberg plan of rebuilding better. But I think also in areas where they do decide to rebuild, they need to figure out what the infrastructure is that's going to protect those houses. So it's not even an issue of building the building harder. It's, you know, what is the wetland infrastructure or the barrier island infrastructure that can be put in place to protect those areas. And, you know, the Army Corps of Engineers already does this, building these barrier islands, but I think if they could build them in a way that actually also grows over time, it would be really helpful. And I think they're just starting to hire landscape architects, the Army Corps, which I think will be helpful, because maybe then they'll create systems that will grow over time instead of deteriorate over time.
I was also wondering if you could speak a little bit more, in some more detail about funding projects and how the projects got initiated, because I was curious about the Sponge Park. Did you initiate that project? Did the councilwoman initiate?
We have a really weird process. We sort of find projects. We look for things that are wrong with, or we think are wrong, or I think are wrong with the city, or places that could use our help, and then go in and find like NISCA funding. Like the first project I did for the BQE was with a grant from the New York State Council on the Arts. I got it was like a $10,000 individual artist grant. So if you haven't applied for those, apply, they're great. But it helped me develop my ideas about ecological infrastructure. And then that work was used by my congresswoman to then go to Washington and bring back a $300,000 grant for the further study of that area. And then on that model, I worked with the Gowanus Canal Conservancy on the development, again through NISCA, of the initial ideas for the Gowanus Canal Sponge Park. And the scope of that project has since expanded, and the community groups with which I work is much broader. But what we ended up doing is we did the initial work with the Conservancy, and then we worked with another community group, the Gowanus Canal Community Development Corporation, which was actually the parent group of the Conservancy. They hate each other, but we're trying to bring everybody together with money. We applied for a grant with them, for environmental justice grant from the state, and we got another $60,000 with that. We used the materials from both of those grants to get money from City Council for the construction. So that was working with both organizations because City Council wanted both to be represented, and so they came together. Then we worked with the Center for Urban Pedagogy to get another grant from the New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission, and that grant was actually a pretty big one. That was like $180,000, and that one funded some of our design work to develop that first pilot project. Once we had the pilot project going, we then used that material to apply for another grant on behalf of the DEC and parks, although we left it kind of ambiguous so we could sort of pick the agency we wanted. But my firm did it. It's kind of crazy. I don't know. We're acting like a not-for-profit, and we're not, although it makes us a not-for-profit. But we just got a $500,000 grant from the state to build this project. So all this money, it's still like just enough to build it, but it's all coming together, and I feel like we're going to make a difference. So I don't know if it's a replicable model, but it feels like the right thing to do, and it's definitely a hybrid. We don't really have a contract with the city. We're kind of we decided to work together. We're like, okay, we have sort of a memoranda of understanding. We have who's doing what, and it's okay. Because I went to the city and said, well, I have the money for the design, you have the money for the construction. Let's team. And we've just been working that way, which is very unusual. It's pretty wacky. So we're trying to do that also with our BQE project, working with Councilwoman Reyna and look for grants, figure out how we can push that project forward. So.
That was incredible, that diagram you showed where you broke down all the different agencies involved in that one tiny piece of land. It's incredible. So talking of models, do you have anything replicable or tips for people who have to deal with a lot of agencies in terms of communication? How on earth do you deal with all those?
Be really, really patient.
Yeah, I can imagine. And just basically repeat yourself.
No, it's actually, I think the issue is just being really clear. And having a diagram like that is actually really helpful. And it's really useful to just sort of record all of the steps along the way. I like to do that graphically. I like to do that for community groups too. When they've made a particular decision, sort of, show them the decision that they've made in some kind of graphic way, or show improvement, or I don't know. I should have shown this. I had this diagram of a wheel that had different criteria within the spokes of the wheel for the BQE project. And right now, the spoke that's about transportation is, all filled out, but the spokes that are about public health and development are like, zero. So the idea is that along the way, you have these other spokes on the wheel that could fill out. And I think in an ideal case, you create this in such a way that in the end, all of the criteria are maxed out to the extent that they can be. So yeah,
graphic representation really helps you.
It really does. It really does. And I had to talk to the BBC News the other day, and I didn't have drawings. It was a radio show, and it was awful. It was awful because I'm so used to sort of pointing to my drawings and saying, well, this is how you do it, and here's examples, and it was really challenging. So I think visual art is really key to all this work.
Should we open? Yeah. Let's take some questions from the students first, and then we'll like to the general public. Any students first? Yes.
It sounds like going back to the beginning, like the early days of New York. I was wondering what will happen to New York, especially how does it affect city life in general?
Well, I think New York isn't going to be Vermont, but so what we need to do is actually figure out what our sort of balance is between urbanity and how much sort of this natural function can occur, and balance that. So that's why my thought is, okay, it can be improved. Right now our streets are not permeable, and 28% of the city is street. So that's a big change that you could make to improve at least the water system and the hydrology. We could have a lot more trees, and I think the Parks Department and the Million Trees Initiative is actually working toward that. We could have many more wetlands, but we don't want to have them everywhere. They should be in places where they're actually sustainable, and they should be in places where you actually have the shallow waters, and they should be in places where you're not necessarily wanting to have boats coming in and out. So, we need to have a comprehensive plan that weighs all of the different criteria and lays that out. But I think fundamentally the experience of the city could be very different, and it could be really great. So.
Hi, I'm not a student but an interested by the with your description of Eden's being looking at integration between ecological systems and urban systems, a lot of it's coming from the perspective of developing environmental infrastructure and growing park areas and reserve areas and that kind of thing, which are clearly social spaces. And so I was wondering to what extent you explicitly, especially when you're dealing with various stakeholders and mapping and that kind of thing, do you address that issue of actual social infrastructure and cultural infrastructure, because it's something which kind of can be hard to represent and kind of exists, on top of that space.
With the BQE project, there were a couple of diagrams I didn't show. The BQE currently divides the neighborhood, and on one side you have the Dominican gangs, and on the other side you have the Puerto Rican gangs. And on one side we had one community group that we were working with, and on the other side was the other community group that we were working with. And then then there was this other community group that had been given the funding because the two community groups that we were supposed to be working with didn't know us see eye to eye. So what we're doing is trying to actually, because of the gang thing, there's this line that really clearly defines the territories between the two groups. And in building the park, we're trying to create this territory that kind of starts to make that line a little fuzzy. And it's a space of recreation, and it's a space where kids are going to come and play, and it's a space where the community is going to come out and use all the time. There's going to be people out there. So our idea, and actually what's been remarkable, is that the two community groups that were not originally getting along are now actually starting to come together. So they both had these really strong, patriarchal heads, and these guys are starting to actually talk to each other, and because they realize it's for the benefit of the community, and that we're really just trying to bring it all together. And I think Councilwoman Reyna has done a great job in sort of making that happen. And I think also the strength of the, again, the idea, the visual idea has helped people really dream that this can happen. So.
Yes, and mind you, I was at a panel this morning with Naksha, so you obviously Housing Authority on their response to Sandy, so the new school, in fact. And one issue that came up very prominently was, especially from Red Hook and Joe, and then also John Shea, director of NYCHA, they brought up this issue of attitude. It's just a negative perception of people in public housing projects or low-income, low-lying areas of the city, just perceptions of them as criminals or such, and they feel it's really inhibiting much the response that's needed, especially in time of disaster. There's a disinvestment, then disaster just reveals what's been going on all along. So what are your thoughts about issues with attitudes, for example, about issues of bridging the issues of class and such? What are some of your thoughts on that?
In NYCHA housing? I mean, there's a
Not
lot of...
just NYCHA, but just across the city. And it's been a pressing issue ever since Moses built the BQE through neighborhoods of Brooklyn instead of routing all East River.
Yeah, there was a lot of resentment. I live in Brooklyn Heights. My office is in Brooklyn Heights. And, we got the promenade and Cobble Hill, got the BQE going right through the middle, and there's still resentment between the
There's
neighborhoods.
some actually advocating for it now, and
Right.
so there'll be more transit use.
With there are a lot of those issues. It's interesting because a lot of the really vulnerable areas where the public housing exists are actually areas that are being gentrified. I look at Red Hook, and Red Hook is, it is getting gentrified, and it's a quite, it's in Zone A, and I see that as kind of problematic. I mean, I'm not quite sure how to answer your question, actually, because my work tries to make the city better for everybody. It's not really targeted toward. I mean, actually, we did have a diagram again with the BQE project, looking at how the city wanted to redevelop the BQE in Cobble Hill and Carroll Gardens, and that was potentially a $1 billion project, like capping that whole area, over really giving any traction to thinking about Williamsburg, because in Williamsburg they had put all of their energy into the Williamsburg waterfront and the rezoning of the Williamsburg waterfront, and making that available to developers, and they had downzoned the area that I was working in for Councilwoman Reyna. So and the area that I was working with for her had a population of 160,000 people, who are some of the poorest people in the city. The area in Cobble Hill, on the other hand, had half the population and some of the wealthiest people in the city, or at least some of the wealthiest people in Brooklyn. So it was like, wait, that project cost $1 billion, and this project cost $100 million. We have more people here, but they're poor, and you've downsized. So, I don't necessarily always understand how these decisions are made, except that it all seems to come down to economics, and the city wants to get more tax money. I mean, I try to stay optimistic.
It seems like your firm is just pioneering this really unique approach to sort of these issues, and it seems like the more people thinking about these sorts of things would be better for the city. So how do you encourage other people to devote resources and thinking to these issues that you're interested in, or other firms, or do you want that?
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I try to lead by example. I try to encourage a lot of people to get involved. I mean, I try to encourage young people to lead firms. I've actually, yeah. There are a number of people who have sort of graduated from my office. They've gone off, and I keep saying, okay, when are you going to start your own firm? When are you going to get the word out there? So I feel like I have this kind of series of disciples that will go out and be in other parts of the world and work to carry on these issues. And I also, I teach at Cooper Union, and I taught at Harvard, I taught at Syracuse, and I taught at City College. I'm kind of the roving teacher. So I'm hoping that through teaching young people, that will also help. Actually, I also gave a lecture at my daughter's high school, so I'm hoping that inspires the next generation. But the idea is, I'm trying to write and trying to publish and get the word out there. And that way, we're trying to get the information out in the media. I write letters to the editor. I'm kind of like, trying to get the message out to the public, and also out to other designers who can carry it on. Yeah.
My question is, if there's on international level similar projects, is there any connections from your projects that would go like global? You showed the world map where the critical areas are. Are there any like on the global scale?
Well, a few years ago, I gave a lecture in Krakow, Poland, and there were some firms in Sydney that were doing some really interesting ecological work, and I really liked their sensibility. I think there are firms all over the world that are approaching these issues in interesting and different kinds of ways. I mean, the nice thing about interacting with people, they have these conferences. The International Federation of Landscape Architects has conferences, and the great thing about those interactions is that you can see what the different approaches are, and particularly in relation to different climates, because it is so different. When we're thinking in the abstract about the use of, say, a mangrove forest in Florida, but then when you work with someone who has used those or tried to develop those ecologies, you learn what all the really sort of tangible issues are in terms of getting them built. So I think there are a lot of interesting ideas out there, and I think everywhere you go, people say, "Oh, it's so hard to get things done here, wherever they are. That the government doesn't let us do this," but except in Holland, they seem to be able to do a lot. They really support their designers. Actually, and I just went on I was invited by the French America Foundation to go on a sustainability tour of France, which was a real coup, because I got to go to Saint-Étienne and Lyon and Nantes and Paris, and saw approaches that some were ecological, some were art-based, and some were based on the development of kind of a design, industrial design kind of economy. They were trying to save Saint-Étienne with this development of kind of an art and industrial economy. And it was really interesting to see how those plans were played out. But they also have a lot of money coming from the government for the development of culture. So they would say, "Oh yes, that money came from the Ministry of Culture to pay for, the curation of this great art program in Nantes." And you see that they've invited these artists from all over the world to develop these projects, and it's become this great sort of tourist attraction for people from all over the country. And in Lyon, it's more of there you have different kinds of economies. There's more of a mercantile. There's more money in Lyon. It's a bigger city, so there's more diversity of different kinds of things happening. But again, the money is coming from the government to really push these different ideas.
One more question.
Or four.
I was just curious, sort of building on that, but more on a local level. How are you collaborating with projects that are sort of similar, like the Lowline Park, that kind of connects tangentially through Williamsburg, and groups like that? Are you trying to expand and build together, or are you sort of focused on the specific section of the BTU that you're working with?
Well, I haven't really worked with that group. There are a lot of, New York is pretty big. If there are kind of natural sort of extensions, I think it makes sense to collaborate. I mean, that's how we got involved with the Center for Urban Pedagogy. They have this great program called the Sewer in the Suitcase, which was explaining combined sewer overflows. And we thought, well, this is a natural partnership. It really made sense. because we can work together to educate people about how this whole park is going to help. I've done a lot of work with the Swim Coalition. I align with, with groups where, the strength of the partnership can actually push forward. And, I'm always happy to sort of entertain those partnerships, because then we can go after funding, and why not get together and do that. We worked with the Two Bridges organization, which is actually a public housing organization, advocacy group, on some grant proposals for the area between the Manhattan and the Brooklyn Bridge, which was the subject of the studio that I taught at Harvard. So, we'd done all this research on their area and we loved it, and so we've been continuing to work with them to just help them increase the resilience of that zone. So it's not like we're trying to exclude anybody, but we just are doing what we can, and always happy to entertain more partnerships. So. You can ask me at 5:30.
Oh, okay.
Well, all right.
Go.
Well, I have two questions.
One.
One is, you mentioned earlier about the importance of developing a public persona, an identity, and what kind of public persona is that like an architect or a public space advocate? The other question is, why do you encourage designers to be firms?
Well, part of that is that, I didn't want to get all gendered on you, but there aren't that many female leaders of firms, and I've had a lot of women working for me, and so I try to encourage them to go and start firms. I look at, say, Hargraves Associates, and you have George Hargraves and you have Mary Margaret Jones, and they are partners, but it's called Hargraves Associates. And Mary Margaret is just incredible and so smart, but it's not Hargraves Jones. And I find that problematic. I don't know why there aren't more women at the top of the profession, landscape architecture or architecture, and so that's been part of it. So, but it's not just gender issue, but I just that was part of my thinking on that. And I've had a lot of really smart women working for me, so I'm trying to say, let's go for it. And and then the identity issue actually probably stemmed also from a similar origin, in that early in my career, or at least early in the formation of my firm, so I guess that's not my career, but early in the formation of my firm, I went to this program at the Beverly Willis Architecture Foundation called Fabricating Your Identity. And it talked about the importance of sort of, basically creating your persona. But I think more important than your persona is having, and this is something I learned when I worked with Brad Klopfel at Allied Works, is having a really clear vision of what you want to do. And that vision, you should be able to just say it in a sentence or two sentences. And it should be the thing that sort of drives everything that you do. And you go back through your work and you say, okay, yes, I get it. This is why I'm taking this project. I mean, some projects clearly you take for money, but ultimately they should be for money, and they should be helping to fulfill your vision of what you want to do as a designer. So, maybe the term fabricating your identity sounds a little contrite, but it's really, making sure that your vision and everything you do is aligned.
That's great. Well, thank you all for coming, and let's take the conversation next door where we can have some wine and cheese and snacks, and please join me in thanking Susannah Drake.